How's everybody doing? You having a good time? Good. Actually, not so good, because now we're going to talk about disinformation. No, I'm actually thrilled to have this conversation. We've got an amazing panel here. We are going to sort of talk about the flip side of storytelling and movement building. What happens when information and narratives are used to mislead, to sow doubt or division, or exert control. And we've got someone who can sort of speak pretty directly to that question. I want to ask you, Sharif Ali, the CEO of Islamic Relief USA, to share a little bit of your firsthand experience with disinformation. What's it like to be the target of it? Give us the 30-second version of what happened.
Yeah, so where do you start, right? But actually, I want to tell you a quick story about when I first became CEO of Islamic Relief USA in 2017. I was 2 weeks on the job, and one of our government relations and public affairs staff came into my office and said, hey, I know you're trying to just feel your way through here, but we have something kind of important that I need to talk to you about. And there was an amendment in the appropriations bill that was, and he shared with me that it said that this is an amendment that was brought by Representative Ron DeSantis at the time from Jacksonville, Florida, who's now the governor. And that amendment proposed that Islamic Relief worldwide, the federation, part of our federation, would not be able to receive any state or USAID funding. At that point, 2 weeks in, we had to mobilize all of our networks, our friends at Interaction, our colleagues, different faith-based institutions, our friends on Capitol Hill, to defeat this appropriations bill. And in addition to that, we kind of had an act of God that helped us. Hurricane Irma, unfortunately, hit in Florida, and Representative DeSantis didn't appear at the appropriations hearing and decided the amendment actually got pulled. But at the same time, that was an opportunity there that was led by disinformation, where an organization was trying to attempt to call our organization a terrorist organization and to try to prevent us from receiving government-based funding. Unfortunately, even the victims of this disinformation can be people in Congress.
And tell us a little bit about what it feels like for an organization to go through that experience. Does it take a big morale hit? Obviously, you were 2 weeks on the job, so that's a lot to have on your plate right away. But from an organizational perspective, what's that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're a staff member, you're thinking, what is this true about our organization, number one? So you have to even educate your staff and really share with them the truth and let them learn about it. Number two, though, there's a major concern about how is this going to affect the future of the organization. So it really does have an impact on morale. It impacts also your partnerships with your colleagues in nonprofits. We have a great network of partners internationally and domestically. And you'll see many of them are going to get a little bit nervous in working with you. Many of them do stand with you, though, which is one of the things that I think was due to the established great work that we did together. And then finally, the biggest thing is working with financial institutions. And this is one that I think is the most critical, because they're extraordinarily risk-averse. So for them to see one news article about you, their AML or their compliance departments are raising the red flag. Hey, there's a problem here. And then you're unfortunately in a situation where you have to convince a financial institution, no, we're legit, here's all of our information so that you could continue to work with us.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
And I want to get into more of it in a second. But first, Michael Koo, let me turn to you. You're the co-chair of the Climate Disinformation Coalition at Friends of the Earth, but you've been involved in this space for a really long time, working on the disinformation problem generally. Can you give us a little bit of context? I mean, first of all, what is disinformation? What are we talking about? And how big of a problem is it right now?
Great. I think it's really helpful to start with the difference between your uncle accidentally sharing something, which is an honest mistake, and disinformation, which is intentional with a purpose, usually trying to target a demographic group or an issue. And so I think what we see in the field of climate disinformation is people thought about climate change for 50 years. But now we're at this unique period where a small group of people are getting a massive outsized influence due to non-transparent algorithms that are just amplifying their voices. So last year in February, you might remember in Texas, there was this historic windstorm snowstorm, and dozens of people died. It was a cause relatively of extreme climate change, and it was exacerbated by the fossil fuel infrastructure in the state that was out of date and was poorly done. What they did, a small group of people turned around to say, well, this was the fault of frozen windmills. And they
Frozen windmills?
Frozen windmills. And they found this picture, which they borrowed from Sweden from 2015, and said, oh, this is the height of hypocrisy, a diesel helicopter spraying down a windmill. This is your Green New Deal for you. It's one thing for two people to say that to one another, but it's another thing for that to go from a small corner of the internet, which we documented over 4 days, went to a larger portion, which then went to Tucker Carlson, which then went to Governor Abbott's lips, that he made that a talking point in just 4 days, that kind of disinformation that nobody believes it, substantively it's not true. The mainstream media did a great job of actually debunking that by day 2, but it didn't matter. The amplification tools that these people are manipulating are giving a small group of people this really outsized voice.
Tucker Carlson seems like a particularly significant node in that network that you just described, but that's probably a different panel discussion.
Yes.
So I have sort of the two of you sitting next to each other. You've actually worked together quite a bit. Michael and Sarah Brahma, head of policy at Pinterest. This is a problem that exists in large part on social media. Pinterest, I think, has taken it upon itself to be a leader in this space. Can you talk about what that means? What is a proactive social media platform within the context of the problem that we're talking about today?
Yeah, sure. And again, thank you so much to Devex for including us in this conversation on this important issue. And just to back up, for those of you who aren't familiar with Pinterest, we're a visual inspiration network, visual inspiration platform. And people from all over the world, more than 400 million people from all over the world, come to Pinterest to find inspiration to do things in their lives every day. And we want to build and cultivate a positive, inspiring, inclusive platform. And that doesn't happen by accident. We know our mission is to bring everyone inspiration to create a life they love. And unfortunately, as we've been talking about, not all content on the internet is inspiring, right? So we need to have some guardrails or guidelines or policies for what is not okay to be saved or shared or created on Pinterest, because we have to be really deliberate about creating the platform that we want, right? We have to deliberately build the platform and the product the way we want. We have to create policies to create that inclusive and positive and inspiring space. And harmful misinformation is not inspiring, so there should not be a place for it on our platform. And we, like you said, have tried to be proactive in misinformation. If there's content out there in the internet, we can't kind of turn an eye and say, well, it's never going to come to us. The internet is all interconnected. It's very dynamic. These narratives that we're talking about are constantly changing and moving around to different platforms, as Michael just talked about. So we try to be proactive. We actually first developed a misinformation policy back in 2017, focused on health misinformation. And since then, we've learned, all of us, a lot more about harmful misinformation and how online misinformation can cause real-world harm. So we've expanded our misinformation policies over the years to include not just health misinformation, like anti-vaccine content, which is prohibited, and election misinformation, which we've all learned a lot about. And then climate misinformation was the next area where we read the news and we keep track of the industry and reports coming out of the UN, and have learned that climate misinformation is causing real harm. It's impeding efforts to build a healthy planet. And so our teams engaged with groups like Michael's to learn more about what those narratives are. What is harmful climate misinformation? What does climate denialism look like online? What might it look like on Pinterest? And how can we get ahead of this? How can we make sure it doesn't become a problem, that we are not part of that narrative that Michael just talked about with the frozen windmill, and we're not contributing to that we are trying to keep our platform safe. So we worked very closely with the Climate Disinformation Coalition and other climate scientists and others to learn more about that space. We can't possibly be experts on every type of misinformation that's out there, so we need to partner with others to learn from them, get feedback on our approaches, hear what might work, what might not work, and then build a policy to try to keep that type of content off our platform.
Yeah, that's great. Michael, I want to hear from you what this process was like, because you're pushing the social media platforms to do more. What does it look like when it's successful?
We have been, and it was a night and day experience working with Facebook, Twitter, Google, that we usually try and press for better policies, to Pinterest. And it really speaks to the whole false mystery of social media. These are not algorithms that sprung up upon themselves. They're written by humans, it's code written by humans, and it can be changed by humans. And Pinterest from the very beginning said, we have a goal of creating a platform that is inspiring, and that means there's certain decisions that you do long before you met us in a bunch of different ways. And so that intention is actually everything. Past that, it's then dealing with the definitions and the rules that you're going to set for it. But it really is like every platform can do this. Disinformation is a created phenomenon. It's not something that just happens to us. And certainly the massive amplification of disinformation that we see.
But Pinterest has been an outlier in your experience.
Well, they have been absolutely the leader in our view, so thank you. But over the last year, we've seen a bunch of the platforms all sort of slightly stumble over themselves to take small actions here and there. I think we can safely say, like, the conversation of disinformation, everyone agrees it's a bad thing. Maybe we saw January 6th and saw there's real life consequences to disinformation. Now we're at the stage of...
Or maybe you're Sharif and your entire first year of being CEO of Islamic Relief has been overwhelmed by this issue.
The racialized disinformation is the strongest disinformation too. So we have to take this on, but we know via Pinterest, but also by other companies, we can do this. This is not something that we have to resign ourselves to. This is the future of all of our discussions on any issue.
So the social media policy piece is obviously a huge part of this. Many of our guests here, participants here today, are working on the sort of development, humanitarian, global health side of things. Can you talk a little bit about how your organization, Sharif, has had to, I don't know, like, have you had to become expert in disinformation and social media to be able to understand the information context that you're sort of operating in now? That must require a huge amount of work.
Yeah, we definitely had to become what we call like reputation management experts. I think we had to understand we had to be able to map out all the different areas where media came out, and we had to be able to properly be able to understand what the messaging is coming from so that we could actually also properly develop our own counter-narrative. And the counter-narrative, we believe, is obviously the truth. So we're trying to share the truth with the public. So we've developed our own, you've had to build a whole crisis communication protocol. You have to have messaging in place already. You have to have channels and mapping of the different stakeholders that you have to interact with. You also have to be able to talk to your banking relationships ahead of time to be able to keep them up to date with you. We have to be very proactive with our financial institutions that we're working with, because we don't want a wire transfer to delay a program in Afghanistan or in Syria or some other conflict zone where financial operations are already concerned about sending money in those countries. So they don't want to add another risk area to deal with. So our approach has been from our communication side, our engagement side, and our financial and operational side. How do we make sure that we put these controls in place to prevent these issues from steamrolling our operations?
So what are you looking for? You're looking for one article that comes out in, random news publication in some part of the world, and then what do you do when you see that?
Well, we do like a risk assessment at that point. So we have media monitoring, as many organizations do, and when we determine what's the reach of this article and is it worth responding to? Because also you have to be careful that sometimes when you find disinformation on the web, if you respond to it, you're actually amplifying it and it grows. So we have to be very careful. You have to make that decision. But you also know that there are certain individuals that will get that information. So you have to be able to share that counter narrative with those people that you know will probably receive it, that have an impact on your work. And in addition to that, there was an example, for instance, in Bangladesh around 2017 as well, when after the Rohingya were trying to settle in Cox's Bazar, Islamic Relief was applying for a permit to be able to deliver services there for the refugees. Unfortunately, there was some media around there that Bangladesh had banned Islamic Relief from operating. So we had to be able to take that information and say, number one, it's not true, and we're just in the process of applying for a permit. And we had to be able to kind of counteract that with many different groups that were trying to make a noise about Islamic Relief not being able to respond. So yeah, so those are the kind of efforts that we have to take into account.
Yeah, and that's a lot for a humanitarian organization that's using limited resources and making calculations about how many lives you can save with those resources. Presumably that's why the impetus for proactivity on the social media side, on the policy side, to lift some of that burden so it's not one organization sort of sitting off on an island. Are those two worlds connected? Like Sarah and Michael, are you hearing from organizations that are having experiences like this and then factoring that into what you understand to be kind of the definitions of the problem and how to solve it?
Yeah, I think it is a big burden to put on organizations that don't have a lot of resources to expect them to be able to fight all this. I think you can't turn a blind eye that you could potentially be the target of that. And be ready to counter those narratives. We have seen some bigger organizations, government agencies, public health agencies, have teams that work on exactly this, pre-bunking. The U.S. Census Bureau in 2020 was really concerned about misinformation about the census process and that people weren't going to participate in the census because there were conspiracies going around about what census workers were doing. And so the Census Bureau actually put together a trust and safety team to work with social media companies and others. They had kind of a website where they could, as soon as they saw memes going around or new misinformation narratives, they would put out information refuting it, saying, we're the authority on this, this is not what's happening. They could reach out to different companies if they saw that content being shared and say, that's not true, we can confirm that's not accurate. And so as much as you can kind of pre-bunk, have materials ready to go, react if you do see that, and have that network and make sure, again, these are not things that might show up in one place and stay there forever. If it did, it wouldn't really be an issue, right? The issue is when it kind of goes around the internet, it gets shared on different platforms. And so we have seen some organizations do that. The Census Bureau is one. Different academic organizations did that for the US elections the last time around, where they almost in real time were sharing if they saw misinformation crossing platforms, so that platforms, to amplify the efforts the platforms themselves were doing. And then we work with public health organizations like the WHO and the CDC on issues like COVID misinformation. COVID over the last 2 years, a lot of information has changed, right? It's not like we just had one piece of information about COVID and that's it, right? It's constantly dynamic. The pandemic's evolving, how we're responding is evolving. And so being able to be in touch with people who can help us be that authoritative voice that we can look to and say, is this true? What are you concerned about? What are those harmful narratives out there? Has been really helpful for us. We can't possibly be experts on climate and health and targeting of protected groups and election misinformation. So if organizations do have a capability to partner, that's incredibly helpful for us.
Right. It's an extremely dynamic challenge. But I want to differentiate. Information is changing all the time. So what is misinformation one day might not be the next day, or vice versa. But disinformation, as Michael, as you pointed out at the outset, is something different. It's an intentional effort to mislead, right?
Yeah, and I think I'd just echo sort of the points here that this is our philosophy is that this is a structural problem that you can't solve on an individual level. So everyone says teach your grandparents not to share this. That's sure, maybe you should do that, but this is an industry that has created certain conditions, and there's certain people trying to push it, whether they're racists trying to push this one agenda, or they're anti-trans people who are trying to push that. They're manipulating those systems. So it's those systems that need to change and can be changed. So, you can see when Pinterest passed this policy, President Obama came out and said, this is a great example of something a company can do. So that we don't just sit here saying that this system of attacking small groups by even smaller groups of people isn't allowed to be sort of the standard that we accept in society.
Right. And what do you see as sort of the next evolution of this challenge? Certainly those who are pushing disinformation are becoming aware of how organizations and social media companies are responding to that and pushing back against it. So, if you're in Sharif's chair today, what's sort of the next iteration of threat that organizations might face?
I think there's two different paths that we have in front of us, is to treat these companies like every other industry in America or across the world. You think about an airline industry or like a baby seat manufacturer. They make a faulty product, they have to tell people about it and recall it, right? That's just a standard product harm model that these companies haven't, most of the companies, Pinterest certainly an exception, haven't even adopted, that they have to be responsible for it. So that's the model that we need to have as a general expectation that we've had for so long. But as we can all guess, the US congressional legal system is under some amount of peril now. So what will you get here is an open question. But Europe has passed the Digital Services Act, which is this landmark law that just passed last week that is going to require transparency. That is the first step to understanding what other harms we're looking at and how can we actually document them and prevent them from harming particular groups. So there's some hope. There's also some trepidation.
Right. As a humanitarian organization, you've got some hard-earned experience about this now. What would be your advice, Sharif, to other organizations that might find themselves kind of in a similar situation where, something pops up, it's not true, maybe they don't know exactly who's behind it, but it seems like somebody is. What's the first step, and what are some things you wish you had known, when this first came onto your radar that you do now?
Yeah, so I'm kind of blessed because I've been able to work with other smaller organizations as well to help them prepare for the situations and actually also to help them respond. So for instance, we created at Interaction the Together Project, which is a group of organizations.
Interaction is the network of NGOs, mostly in the United States, right? Humanitarian NGOs based
out here in DC. And in the Together Project, specifically working to work with vulnerable organizations that might be impacted by disinformation. So we work together to help with addressing these causes and root causes and working together to address congressional members and engaging on government levels. At the same time, I think there's a real critical need for humanitarian organizations specifically to engage with at interaction level, at the NGO space level, where they get to build partnerships and they get to showcase their work. And telling the story about your programs is really critical because it's very easy for disinformation to become almost truth when you're not out there and you're not sharing your counter narrative and the truth about the work that you do. What I would have liked to have learned myself earlier in the process is, it's interesting because I kind of joined Islamic Relief eight years ago, working in that space already in the PR and engagement side. So I kind of knew this was coming. At the same time, I think it was to be confident within ourselves. Sometimes when you're under attack, it's very easy to kind of believe what the public says about you and to feel almost inferior to what the sector allows for you, where you should be. And this being a victim is not a healthy space. It's not good to be a victim, and you have to fight against being that victim. So it's really critical, I think, for organizations, especially ones that are minority-led and vulnerable in those kind of ways, should not feel like they are a victim, and in fact should feel strong enough to push against that victimhood, because it really undermines your capacity to be able to tell your story as well.
I want to dig into that just a little bit further. We have limited time, but you mentioned something earlier, which is it's really hard to push back on these things without making them worse, right? Because engagement just sort of feeds the monster.
Exactly.
Is there anything that you've learned about how to overcome that particular challenge? And maybe it's the partnership piece that you just described.
Yeah, and I think what we do, honestly, is we kind of flood our different mediums, our social and our media relationships to kind of showcase the stories that we have that really show the impact of our work. At the same time, without bringing attention specifically to the item that's being mentioned.
Okay.
But we will have a proactive list of groups that need to be reached out to if an article or a media finding becomes more found publicly. Now, obviously, if it gets on ABC News or CNN, you have to respond, I think, in those circumstances, and you have to publish a statement. But if it's on these
or Devex.
Or Devex, of course.
Which would never happen.
Yeah, that's why I didn't say it.
Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, but on these other, on these smaller, so what happens is you get an article published by this think tank that gets recirculated by hundreds of other small media outlets that you have no idea where they're from and where they're located. So those you have to kind of be patient and disciplined not to respond to.
Yeah.
Even though they are flooding maybe media monitoring sites.
Yeah. Sarah, does that sound right to you as one who
Yeah,
sort of,
I think-
holds the...
Yeah, the one thing I was going to add to that is a little what Sharif has already been saying is it's not just defensive, it's offensive, right? And so this is how we think about countering misinformation on our platform as well, that a big part of it is having strong policies, working with organizations to build those, and then taking down the content that violates it, right? So take down the bad stuff. But if you take down the bad stuff, what's left? You want to elevate good content, right? You want to elevate the actual narrative. You want to elevate expert information. So if you think about COVID-19, we want to take down the COVID-19 misinformation, right? No, COVID vaccines don't make you magnetic. Like, no, this is not true. But what's left, right? How can we elevate messages from the World Health Organization, from the CDC, from your country's health ministry on what is the actual true information? So I think the more organizations can get their content out, make sure that their content is engaging, so you're not facing this data void where it's just the bad content may be gone, but then there's nothing left, right? And so how can platforms, how can organizations elevate that expert content and make it engaging so that people see that? They don't just see the, silly meme or something that's a conspiracy. They actually see the expert content and know where to go and who's authoritative. So it's really that balancing act.
So in the end, it does come down to telling good stories as well. And I'm very sorry, but we have to end it there. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.